Caroline.
Hey, thank you so much. Just to confirm the technical side, you're seeing my main screen.
Yep, that's
okay,
great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to the meeting organizers for inviting me. As you mentioned, I worked in carbon cycle science for my doctoral research using Ameriflux data. So I'm really thrilled to be here and bring a federal policy lens to the incredible data set that Ameriflux data are. So today I'm going to be speaking about translating terrestrial carbon cycle science from the field and from those measurements to federal policy and some of the challenges and opportunities for scaling up nature-based solutions to provide real, tangible climate mitigation benefits. So we know that carbon removal strategies and the land sink is critical to reaching both national and global net zero emissions goals. This figure from a recent National Academies report illustrates projected emissions and the necessary methods for removing carbon from the atmosphere moving forward. And this includes a really significant role for storage and sequestration by vegetation and soils. This snippet from the IPCC 2018 1.5 degree summary for policymakers really drives this point home. Knowing that agriculture, forestry, and other land use related CO2 removal measures that include restoration of natural ecosystems, soil carbon sequestration, they emerge as critical features of virtually all mitigation pathways. And we know importantly that they also provide really important ecosystem co-benefits and can provide social co-benefits and economic co-benefits as well for communities. So we know that protecting and optimizing the land sink is essential to meeting climate goals. And we have increasing understanding of where carbon is stored in biomass and soils. So emerging tools like this land mapping resource from Chris Williams and Natalia Hassler and the Nature Conservancy are providing higher resolution information about the capacity of the terrestrial biosphere to store and sequester carbon. So this shows 2010 forest carbon stock components. And this other portion of the tool shows the soil organic carbon storage as of 2010. So we have increasing understanding of the distribution and capacity for the land sink to provide this important climate benefits. So building on this are natural climate solutions, which serve to both protect these stocks and potentially optimize them moving forward. So what are natural climate solutions? There's a lot of definitions floating out there. There is a non-trivial amount of confusion, between different sectors, both economic and policy and scientific. A 2010 paper by Seddon, Smith, and others does a really nice summary of a number of these definitions, as well as some of the relevant terms that are also embedded in these definitions and some of the relevant concepts. So the definition that I am using is from Griscom et al. 2017, that conservation and management actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ecosystems and harness their potential to store carbon. Building on this, we can also consider natural climate solutions to include enabling the avoidance or reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases and the removal, sequestration, and storage of carbon from the atmosphere in forests, grasslands, crops, and wetlands. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm focusing on the land sector exclusively, so I won't be discussing blue carbon. So we know that there's a number of natural climate solutions with increasing levels of granularity. But this figure from Fargione et al. 2018 provides a really nice roundup of some of the major solutions that exist, as well as their capacity to mitigate climate. We see that there's significant climate mitigation potential in the US when we consider both forests and agriculture and grasslands, including reforestation, natural forest management, fire management, importantly, as well as practices that producers and ranchers can enact on their landscapes as well. I will note that it shows different mitigation potentials for varying prices of carbon. So we know that there is this economic and financial component that I'll be discussing a little bit further along in the talk. And I'll also note the corresponding ecosystem co-benefits of a number of these practices. So what we're seeing on the federal policy side is a huge increase in attention on the land sector to provide climate benefits. The nationally determined contributions announced in April of this year specifically call out agriculture and lands to sequester carbon and scale up climate smart agriculture and forestry, as well as forest protection and restoration and prevention of fires. Additionally, the USDA had a request for public comment earlier this year, and among a number of questions they solicited public responses to included how can USDA help support emerging markets for carbon and greenhouse gases where agriculture and forestry can supply carbon benefits, as well as what data, tools, and research are needed for USDA to effectively carry out climate smart agriculture and forestry strategies. So really important opportunities to think about linking and coordinating measurement data sets like AmeriFlux data. So we have a sense of what carbon solutions are out there, but how are they implemented and who pays? Emissions reductions or removals can be achieved directly by governments and companies or through the purchase of carbon credits in a marketplace. So I'll go through a little bit of background for each of these. So first, we can consider natural climate solutions on public lands. This figure from the Congressional Research Service and Forest Service shows distribution of federal land ownership across the coterminous United States, across both the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service, as well as the Department of Defense, which owns a non-trivial amount of land across the United States for bases and training facilities. In total, the US government owns just shy of about 30% of the US lands. So on these landscapes, one thing that we're tracking are natural climate solutions in the bipartisan infrastructure framework. So laying out here just some of the provisions that are included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which provides approximately $6.5 billion to support natural climate efforts, which I've laid out on the left, but won't go into in too much detail. This also includes the Replant Act, which removes the cap on the Restoration Trust Fund. So a lot of hazardous fuels mitigation, restoration of public lands, burned area recovery. And there's also opportunities for natural climate solutions and reconciliation that is managed by both the House Agriculture Committee and the House Natural Resources Committee. Again, a lot of emphasis on fuel load reduction, as well as resources for the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program out of the Forest Service. So a lot of really important provisions providing resources for enhancing research and development as well. So implementing the natural climate solutions on private lands is a little bit more where the rubber meets the road in terms of the challenges of scaling up natural climate solutions. This figure from the Forest Service shows that more than 50% of US forest land is owned and managed by approximately 11 million private forest owners. So this is not even grasslands and croplands, this is just forest lands. So shows kind of the scale of the number of stakeholders that need to be engaged in order to scale up natural climate solutions, if even only on a portion of these lands. So supporting producers and forest landowners, they can be encouraged and incentivized to adopt natural climate solutions either by voluntary incentive programs or private carbon markets. The former, I'll just go through this really quickly. There's a number of incentive programs in the US Farm Bill that provide grants and loans for implementing climate smart agriculture and forestry practices, conservation efforts, things like that. However, these activities still require reliable quantification and monitoring to contribute to the nationally determined contributions that I mentioned earlier, as well as to evaluate program and practice efficacy in delivering climate benefits. Private carbon markets is the second primary way that private landowners can be and producers can be incentivized to implement natural climate solutions. And we're seeing a lot of attention and interest, particularly among the private sector. You know, companies are adopting net zero targets, driving demand for the voluntary carbon market, or VCM. And more than 1,000 companies that we're tracking in 126 countries have committed or are actively considering net zero carbon neutrality. So this is really driving up a demand for natural climate solutions that can be reliably quantified and verified. So this figure shows the impact of that interest. And currently the demand for credits is growing, but there's also massive investment needed to realize these benefits. So some research that BPC has done has found that investors require a level of certainty that their investment will result in marketable and valuable credits. They want to be confident that the credit yields climate benefits that are identifiable and measurable, as well as additional permanent and verifiable. So that means that they can be monitored over time and verified over a given time scale. So increasingly, there's a global demand for projects, and it currently exceeds the capacity of voluntary carbon markets to deliver these tons at scale. So this requires collaboration from the market space and the scientific community to advance these climate benefits. So this is where terrestrial carbon cycle research and monitoring networks come into play and are essential. Just a smattering of some of the really significant and important long-standing monitoring systems, networks, inventories, missions that are so vital for underpinning the quantification, both of nationally determined contributions as well as these private markets. And I just want to highlight some innovation and coordinated methods that we're seeing to quantify changes in terrestrial carbon. As well as, so for example, the National Academy of Sciences 2019 report showing real-time continuous monitoring, as well as a great example is the ARPA-E Smart Farm program, which is helping to advance in situ measurements, actually not just in situ, but coordinating in situ and unmanned or remote data sets and modeling for quantifying land-based natural climate solutions. I want to highlight here that even the White House is quite interested in this space. For example, they just held 2 workshops to review data and methods used to measure and verify carbon and greenhouse gas content and fluxes in a variety of landscapes. So they brought together a number of researchers, academics, folks working in the private sector who are interested in investing in climate solutions to dig into some of these challenges. So there's quite a lot of discussion happening in this space and a huge emphasis on our ability to quantify natural climate solutions and also where the gaps are. So I want to highlight some really great research from Hemis, Runkel, Novik, Baldacci, and Field earlier this year, describing the ways that eddy covariance measurements are uniquely positioned to advance natural climate solutions and quantifying their efficacy over time. This paper identified that eddy covariance data are really useful, particularly for so-called hidden hidden carbon stocks and their changes over time, such as soils or perennial grasslands. They can also be really useful for quantifying non-CO2 Flux is an emissions, so this can be really useful for landscapes and producers that are using fertilizers, as well as production systems that result in emissions, such as rice cultivation. On the BPC side, the way that we're approaching this is we've convened a task force to, in the recognition that America's lands have an important opportunity to deliver carbon removal benefits and also provide economic benefits for producers and forest landowners. And this group includes leaders across industry, agriculture, forestry, environment, nonprofits, and research organizations, as well as former government associations, or officials rather. And just this week, they released near-term policy priorities for the 117th Congress. I just want to highlight among these two that are particularly useful and relevant to the data and monitoring priorities that I mentioned earlier, which is to strengthen the integrity and transparency of voluntary carbon markets, as well as foster agriculture and forestry technology innovation. And what we found from this is that, again, connecting to the investors needing confidence, measurements must capture the spatial and temporal variation in emissions and sequestration, and methods for quantification have to be resilient to the landscape. And these three lower bullet points are really key areas where flux measurements are uniquely valuable. So we held 2 technical workshops with a number of researchers as well as product developers in this space, including some folks on this call today. And a few of the high-level insights that we gleaned from these workshops was that there remains a need for enhanced, expanded, and coordinated data collection. Flux and stock measurements should be used to advance model development and ground truth new technologies and methods. Clarity is required for understanding and quantifying ecosystem change and co-benefits. And there's an important role for the federal government to provide credibility, clarity, standardization, and integrity to the market and endorsed monitoring systems. So there's a lot happening. I know I went through a lot of material, so please don't hesitate to reach out afterward. I'll provide my contact information. And I just want to flag for this group, there's a hearing later this week in the House Agriculture Committee that I'm excited about. They'll be discussing voluntary carbon markets in agriculture and forestry, and I'm sure a significant portion of this is going to be around the monitoring, reporting, and verification required for these markets, as well as 2 bills that we're tracking that also hinge on these quantification efforts. Thank you very much. Again, it was my pleasure to speak here today. And I've provided my email address if you would like to reach out with any questions, and really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That was a really excellent talk and overview of the policy sphere and links to science and this community in particular. I think we've got a good few minutes for questions. So I'd ask everyone to just raise their hand from the reactions button on the bottom. And Caroline, if you just go ahead and select anyone you can see. Is that okay?
Yes. Let me just stop my sharing. Yes, Ben.
Hi, thanks, Caroline. Excellent talk and really interesting. I'm curious if you could just share a little bit about the interactions you've had as a bipartisan policy center person. Are there kind of surprises about what is or is not bipartisan in this space?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I guess probably unsurprisingly, research, science, innovation, quantification is really bipartisan. There's really a great deal of interest, across the aisle to advance these systems and build on what we have in terms of monitoring and inventories, such as the natural resource or the National Resources Inventory, as well as the forest inventory and analysis. Trevor?
Hi, Carla. Yeah, it was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. It was a wonderful overview of the space. And I was wondering in particular if you could speak briefly to where you see eddy covariance measurements making the biggest impact in this space and when they will be most appropriate for deployment for a natural climate solutions project.
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of different spaces. I know that USDA is working to advance a systematic approach to quantifying natural climate solutions on the landscape. You know, there's the soil health demonstration trials, but that's kind of piecemeal funding, individual grants. So I think USDA is working to develop something that's a little bit, you know, more organized and comprehensive. And eddy covariance measurements as part of that, you know, for providing that information about, you know, two similar landscapes and one in which the solution is implemented and one in which it isn't. Again, I'm thinking back to Kyle Hemme's paper that discusses some of those pilots and potentials for upscaling. And I think eddy covariance data are really, could be really useful as well for kind of serving as that bridge between in situ measurements, potentially really kind of labor intensive, like soil sampling or things like that, versus you know, passive remote sensing. So kind of serving as that bridge set of data that are, you know, near real time and continuous, I think are a couple of places where they could be really valuable. Yes, Ken.
Yeah, sorry.
Hi, Carolyn. Good to see you. Question.
Good
Nice
to see
talk.
you.
I'll limit it to one. I was wondering about the non-permanent nature of biosphere storage, but let me ask the eddy covariance specific question. The nice paper that you pointed out, which I should read, thanks for pointing out that manuscript. The places where the authors recommend eddy covariance would be useful also seem like places where it's pretty challenging to verify what's going on. And at some point, what's the cost structure there? Can we afford to do that? Or have we gone there yet? Do we know what the cost point is where we say, hey, it's just too expensive to monitor, so we need another way to store?
Yeah, that's kind of the $64,000 question. And I think, you know, it really depends on how, I guess, investments and funding comes into play, but one potential system could be, you know, a recognition among folks working to scale up natural climate solutions is that the private sector investments are really going to be necessary. And, you know, it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg where they want the MRV to invest, but those investment dollars might be necessary to implement something like eddy covariance data. So I think there could be some interesting parallel efforts to expand, you know, the AmeriFlux network. But I think also just those federal dollars are so important, you know, and we've been pushing for increasing, you know, the budgets that provide those program dollars and implement them on the ground in really thoughtful ways.
That's great. Thank you, Margaret. I'm sorry, I know you've got your hand raised, but we should probably stick to time. So thank you so much again, Caroline. That was a really fantastic talk. And I guess there's a natural climate solutions breakout when maybe there's another opportunity to ask those questions.